Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Nina Krasnick. I'm the coordinator of the AgriDENZ project, and I warmly welcome you all today to our webinar, Farm Level GHG Accounting. Yeah, next slide, please, Elin. So before we jump into the webinar, just a few words on the AgriDENZ project for the ones in the room that maybe did not hear about the project before. It's a bilateral cooperation project between Germany and New Zealand, and it's an alliance for the climate. So we aim for advancing low emission and climate resilient agricultural and food systems. And if you want to learn more about our upcoming or previous activities, sign up to our newsletter, which you can do here by the QR code, or also a link will be shared soon in the chat. And we work through three main result areas. So first, we support scientific change between the two countries and also third-party countries. In the second result area, we work at policy level between policymakers and research. And last but not least, we also look at fostering exchange with third-party countries. And we do so through 4 focus areas, and one of them is the farm level GHG accounting area, where we are very happy today to dive deeper into the topic. And to do so, we have implemented a webinar series. So we have started already last month with a presentation by Koen de Koning from the OECD on methods and tools for farm level GHG in estimation at the global level. And we will continue today with our AgriDENZ colleagues, Elin Martinsson and Darran Austin, where they will present on the ongoing work on comparing farm level GHG accounting approaches between Germany and New Zealand. And they are both AgriDENZ topic leads. So Elin is working here at the Thünen Institute in Germany as a research associate, and Darran is a principal advisor for New Zealand domestic agricultural climate policy work at the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries. And yeah, without further ado, I hand over to Elin and Darran, and I'm quite excited to your presentation. And maybe just one note for the audience. This webinar will be recorded, and we will also upload it again to the AgriDENZ website. And you're more than welcome to put your questions in the chat so that I can forward it to the speakers after their presentation. And yeah, we are already above 100 people here in the room, so quite exciting. And yeah, Elin and Darran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina, for the nice introduction. So yeah, I'm Elin Martinsson, and I will today present ongoing work in the AgriDENZ project together with my colleague Darran Austin. And yeah, before starting the presentation, I would also like to mention that this is not work only by me and Darran, but also from several colleagues from our respective countries, where some of them are also here today in the webinar, prepared to answer questions if there are some more specific questions to the respective approaches taken in from our two institutions. So the presentation today will be around half an hour, and after that there will be plenty of time for you to ask your questions to our work. So as Nina said, you can type your questions in the chat whenever you want during the presentation, and Nina will be sure to ask them to us so we can answer everything, hopefully. So the presentation today is about comparing farm level emissions methods in Germany and New Zealand. And before going into the topic, I would like to convince all of you of the importance of comparing methods. And I would like to do so by referring back to the presentation from Koen de Koning. As Nina mentioned, he presented in our webinar in February. For those of you who weren't there or who need a refreshment, you can watch the recording at the AgriDENZ webpage. One of the slides from Koen's presentation looked like this, where he discussed the issue with using the same farms in different greenhouse gas accounting tools leading to different results. So here we have a picture from the UK from 2023, where they are evaluating 6 commonly used tools in the UK, and it's really clear in this graph that the different tools often yield very different results in terms of farm level greenhouse gas emissions. And this, of course, causes problems. So it creates confusion for farmers, consumers, and other stakeholders. It also leads to transaction costs of having to deal with different tools and methods. And it can create potential trade barriers or disputes, particularly between countries. And the question is then, how can we reduce fragmentation? And this is the question that we also consider as a basic motivation for our work. So in different countries, we have seen country-specific approaches being established to increase the national harmonization of methods, so to decrease the fragmentation. One example can be found in New Zealand with the New Zealand Farm Emissions Method, or abbreviated as FEM, where the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries have developed a farm-level method based on the national greenhouse gas inventory. A similar development has been seen in Germany, specifically by the Thünen Institute, which is the responsible authority for the greenhouse gas inventory for agriculture, which have extended their methods for the national inventory to be available for farm-level greenhouse gas estimation in the AgriGHG-tool. Despite these two approaches looking rather similar in this very simple picture, there are, of course, many differences between approaches in different countries, making international harmonization a very complex topic. We want to contribute to making this easier or more clear by contributing to increased international understanding of each other's approaches by developing a framework for studying and comparing farm-level greenhouse gas accounting approaches. So adding to our picture here, how we envision the contribution of our work is to have something similar as we have today in the IPCC guidance and the UNFCCC review for the national inventories, but at a farm level, where we want to establish a framework for reviewing and comparing farm-level greenhouse gas accounting approaches. In our work, we are applying our framework, which we will get to in a few slides, to the New Zealand Farm Emissions Method and the AgriGHG-tool developed at the Thünen Institute. So before going into detail about our study, we would like to brief you a bit on what these two approaches are. So starting with the AgriGHG-tool from the Thünen Institute. This is a prototype API developed by the Thünen Institute, and it's based on the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So methane and nitrous oxide emissions are calculated in the PyGasCM model, and emissions from mineral soils are based on the Roth-C model. So these are the same models which are used for the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. We also have energy-related emissions at the farm and emissions from organic soils, where these two last ones are not yet available as an API. So as I said, it's a prototype currently under development. On this web page from the Thünen AgriGHG-tool, it's stated that the purpose of this tool is to contribute to a harmonization of procedures for calculating farm-level greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, I will hand over to Darran, who will say a few words about the farm emissions method in New Zealand.
Thanks, Elin, and good evening or good morning, everyone. My name's Darran Austin. I'm working at the Ministry for Primary Industries in New Zealand. So at MPI, we've been developing the farm emissions method, or the FEM, for past several years. It was released about a little over a year ago, in the three forms that we mentioned there. The situation in New Zealand is at that point we had about 10 or 11 different methods available, or tools available in New Zealand for calculating greenhouse gases on farm, and a little bit similar to the UK example earlier, applying the same methods to the different methods to the same farms gave quite different results in some situations. So the method, we also have a cloud-based platform that hosts the method, and there's a free web tool that accesses that cloud-based platform that farmers can use to calculate their emissions. Predominantly at present, the API is accessed by processors who use it to use the method to calculate emissions for their farmers and to report through to customers and report their supply chain emissions. We're also working with existing farm management tools to access to use the API to calculate emissions. Given most of these farm management tools have already have the farmers' data in them for that's needed to calculate emissions. Like in Germany, the farm emissions method is based closely on the New Zealand agricultural greenhouse gas emission inventory. Okay, so as part of this work, we've developed a framework to help compare the two methods. It's based on the IPCC framework that's used to guide national greenhouse gas inventory methodologies: transparency, accuracy, comparability, consistency, and completeness. We've also supplemented it with the Bellagio stamp framework, which goes a little bit broader and goes into the purpose and reason that the methodology exists and some other contextual elements. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the fourth and fifth element of our framework around the scope and coverage of the different methods, and also cross-context replicability, which Elin will talk about later in the presentation. So the two methods, when we look at the two methods, both are focused on farm agricultural emissions, so predominantly methane and nitrous oxide on farms. So the scope 1 from a farm's perspective. There's some commonality in that both methods are based heavily on our respective national inventories. The New Zealand method is a little bit more separate from our national inventory. It uses the same equations, but is a little bit more modified to suit the kind of purpose of farm level emissions. And the emission sources covered in each method reflects the national circumstances in New Zealand and Germany. So there's some differences in what they cover and what's focused on. So in New Zealand, pigs and poultry and cropping aren't a big source of emissions, so we don't cover that in FEM. They also tend to be quite separate agricultural enterprises, so we've left that to existing models. In New Zealand, we have farm deer, which is maybe a little bit unique, and that is covered in our FEM, and also sheep is quite a large industry in New Zealand, and we cover that in some detail in our farm emissions method. In terms of overlap, the big area of overlap in commonality is around cattle, particularly dairy cattle, and that's the most kind of comparable element of the two methods. Manure management systems are a little bit different in New Zealand and Germany, so we don't actually have common manure management systems across the two countries, so we couldn't use those. So when we did the comparison that Elin's going to talk about in a little bit, we focused on cattle, as that had the similar tier and was comparable. And you can see there that we've kind of listed out the different elements that are covered and at what tier. Tier 1 being relatively simple and emission factors, and tier 3 much more complex set of equations. And now I'm going to pass back to Elin.
Yes, thank you very much, Darran. So I will talk a bit about our fifth criteria in our framework, which is about cross-context replicability. So in this part of the framework, we empirically compare the methods where there is an overlap. So as Darran just said, we identify enteric fermentation from dairy cows as the emission source, which is accounted for at the same tier in the both methods. And we want to look closer into how this then is estimated. So to do this comparison, we need to understand the farmer inputs, so the farm level inputs feeding into the methods. We need to understand the methodological framework and the equations used. And we need to understand the country-specific parameters determining the emissions in both methods. And before going deeper into our empirical comparison, I want to highlight that this is an exercise to better understand how the data, equations, and country-specific parameters are structured and influence the results. So it's not that we argue that the New Zealand method should be used by German farmers or vice versa, but this is rather an analytical procedure which we have developed to dig deeper into the technical aspects of the methods and the results. So we apply both methods to calculate enteric fermentation from dairy cows to German and New Zealand farms. To do this, we use farm level data. So on the one hand, we have German Farm Accountancy Data Network, or AgriDENZ data, where we have 2,200 German dairy farms. And on the New Zealand side, we are using a data set from the New Zealand Dairy Base on 209 New Zealand dairy farms. And we conduct two comparisons. So first, a comparison using the methods as they are, so just plugging in the data into the existing methods. And secondly, we adapt default parameters. So for example, dairy cow weights are quite different in the two countries. So we adapt this to better reflect the respective countries' conditions. Before going into the comparison, I would like to show also the importance of enteric fermentation in our sample of farms. So here we have two pie charts of the average emissions. So on the left-hand side, we see the average emissions from the dairy-based sample estimated using the New Zealand farm emissions method. And on the right, we see the average emissions from the AgriDENZ sample estimated using PyGAS-EM or the AgriGHG-tool. So PyGAS-EM is the method used in the AgriGHG-tool. And we see here in the light blue part of the pie that enteric fermentation constitutes a rather large share of emissions on these farms. So as I said, we first need to understand the inputs feeding into the methods to be able to compare them. So looking at the two methods, starting with the AgriGHG-tool, to calculate or to estimate enteric fermentation, we need to know the milk yield per cow. We need to know the number of milking cows, and we need to know the NUTS2 region in which the farm is located to be able to derive data, regional data on milk fat and milk protein, livestock weights, and feed. In the New Zealand FEM, we need farm level input on milk yield, milk fat, and protein content of the milk. And we also need to know the number of milking cows in terms of the opening balance, transfer in, transfer out, sales, purchases, and deaths throughout the year. We also need data on feed in terms of kilo dry matter of different feeds, as well as the grazing region of the cow, so we can know, so we can assume the quality of the grazing depending on where the cows are. So in the AgriGHG-tool, all data inputs are in terms of per year, where in the New Zealand farm emissions method, some inputs are on a monthly basis and other inputs are on a yearly basis. So different results when using these methods can of course be a consequence of different data inputs, and we would like to avoid this in the comparison. So we need to somehow harmonize the data inputs. So both of our data sets which we use consider yearly data. So we assume for the number of milking cows, we assume an average yearly number of milking cows on the farm instead of this monthly transaction of cows. And for milk yield, we assume a New Zealand seasonality for milk yield throughout the year. So a share of the total milk yield per year assumed to be produced in the different months. When applying the German data to the New Zealand method, we also use regional values for milk fat and milk protein and for feeds to harmonize the data inputs. Looking at the methodological framework and equations, we can see that the equations for energy are quite similar in the two methods. So looking at the AgriGHG-tool or the PyGAS-EM method, they calculate the net energy for lactation. And in the FEM, we have the metabolizable energy equation, and we see that these are considering similar parameters. However, the equations behind these parameters are different between the two methods. And finally, we will look at the country-specific parameters. So to accurately represent our two samples of farms in the respective methods, we need to do some, or we make some adaptations of parameters. So to represent New Zealand farms in the AgriGHG-tool, we need to, or we test reducing cow live weights to New Zealand levels, increase the days and frequency of grazing, increase mature dairy cow service life, and adjust milk fat and protein values. To better represent German farms in the farm emissions method, we increase cow live weights, increase the metabolizable energy from feed to better reflect the diet of the German cows, and decrease the methane conversion rate, and see how this changes the results. So looking at the results, we see that the results in the two methods are similar when applying the data to the methods without adapting any parameters. So here we have the results for the New Zealand farms applied to both methods, and here we have the results for the German farms. So in these two graphs, on the y-axis, you see the results from the PyGASI method, and on the x-axis, you see the results from the farm emissions method. And it's interesting to see that these are really similar despite the many country-specific parameters in the two countries. So in the next step, we adapt the parameters. So the results get closer after making adjustment to reflect country-specific parameters. And here we look at the mean results. So estimating the tons of CO2 equivalents per mean farm, we see that using AgriGHG-tool on the New Zealand farms leads to a mean difference of 0.95%, and where adjusting the parameters, the mean difference is 0.74%. So we see that both before and after adapting the country-specific parameters, the results produce very similar, or the two methods produce very similar results. There's a similar result for applying German farm level data to the farm emissions method, where the two methods before adjusting parameters is 1.56%, and the difference after adjusting parameters or after adjusting metabolizable energy is 0.13%, so also a very small mean difference between the methods. With that, I would like to summarize this presentation and draw some preliminary conclusions. So the international understanding of different countries' approaches can still be improved. And we want to do this by providing a framework for improving the mutual understanding of farm-level greenhouse gas accounting approaches. So as Darran mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we developed these 6 principles. In this presentation, we focused on the 4th and 5th principles, so scope, emission sources, and deviation from the national greenhouse gas inventory, and the cross-country text replicability. And we apply the framework to the case of the AgriGHG-tool developed at the Thünen Institute and the New Zealand farm emissions method developed at the Ministry of Primary Industries. Some concluding remarks is that the FEM and the AgriGHG-tool illustrates 2 different paths to provide country-specific and science-based methods for farm-level greenhouse gas accounting methods. So the AgriGHG-tool developed an API solution directly from the national greenhouse gas inventory methodologies, whereas the farm emissions method developed a new method considering what data farmers have available and can verify, and based this method on the national inventory. Of course, given national circumstances, the methods, what the methods cover can differ in terms of what emission sources are included. But despite different terminology and country-specific parameters, the equations for calculating enteric fermentation are similar, which is why we focus our more in-depth comparison on this emission source. So we see that the underlying structure and equations of the New Zealand and the Thünen methods are comparable. And however, that there are significant differences in data definitions between the 2 methods. So in our empirical comparison, first of all, to compare the methods, we need to harmonize the data inputs. And we find that the methods can represent the other countries' emissions, increasing the credibility of the emissions estimates internationally. There are several country-specific parameters in each method, but despite this, the results are similar even before making any adaptations of the parameters, which I think is an interesting result. And finally, enteric fermentation from dairy cows can be quite well estimated with FEM and the AgriGHG-tool in a way that's comparable. At the final slide, I would like to get back to this illustration that we provided at the beginning of the presentation, and say that this study attempts to increase the mutual understanding of farm-level greenhouse gas accounting approaches in Germany and New Zealand, and can, in the extension, provide insights for international harmonization. And of course, our study is focusing on these two countries, so the robustness of our framework can be further tested, and the framework could be further developed by also applying it to other countries' approaches. And with that, I would like to say thank you for your attention, and also again mention that this work was not only conducted by Darran and I, but also by our many colleagues listed here on this slide, who's also been participating in the development of this framework. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Elin and Darran, for these insights into your work. I think that was very exciting, and there's already a few questions in the chat. I would like to start with the one posed by Luke Powell. If methods are focused on scope 1, how is the difference between pasture-based animal farming and feed-based animal farming dealt with? Quickly elaborate on this one.
So maybe I can start answering, and then someone else can add on if there's anything more to say. So of course, pasture-based farming and feed-based farming would yield very different emissions regarding the imported feed, so scope 3 emissions. So this is of course not captured in the methods that we are looking at, and particularly not when only looking at enteric fermentation. However, depending on if the animal is fed more pasture-based or more feed concentrates, this still has an influence on the different parameters in the method. So for example, in the New Zealand method, they are assuming a methane conversion rate, so the grams of CH4 per kilo of dry matter intake, and this can differ depending on what the animal is fed, but also, yeah, as you say, as the methods are only looking at scope 1 emissions, it's not included the production of the feed. So that would also, of course, have influences on the farm's emissions. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, or if maybe Darran wants to add something.
Yeah, I'll just add on the New Zealand side, our method, it does include supplementary, what we call supplementary feed, brought-in feed, in addition to pasture. So supplementary feed might be about 10 or 20% of the feed on average for New Zealand dairy farms. When we applied the FEM method in Germany, that obviously we just increased that percentage of feed and entered the different feeds that were prevalent in Germany. So that was like how we literally did the comparison.
Thank you. Then I have a second question here from Vincent Heboy. How are different dairy breeds taken into account in the methodologies, as their emissions can vary significantly and impact emissions intensity?
So should I start here also, and the others can fill in if there is anything more to add? So I'm not an expert on different cattle breeds. However, it's sort of indirectly, or is accounted for through the parameters in the method, maybe most evidently in the cow live weight. So as I said, the German cattle is heavier than the New Zealand cattle, so that's reflected in by the breeds of the animals. But so it's not that you enter what breeds of cattle that you keep on the farm, but it's inherent in the model through the different parameters, I would say. So that obviously reflects what breeds are kept in New Zealand and in Germany, respectively.
That's right. I think maybe it is a good question. It's one that we're working on in New Zealand for our next version of the farm emissions method. So I don't know if Ben might want to talk about the upcoming work to look at different breeds.
Yeah, not too much to add to that, but yeah, essentially reiterate that they're reflected in the parameters that are used. But yeah, for the farm emissions method in upcoming updates, we are looking to
Thank you. Then maybe another question for the New Zealand team from Naomi. What is the reason that pigs and poultry are not included in the FEM?
That initially, I guess pigs and poultry isn't such a big part of our agricultural sector in New Zealand, so it's not generally just not a large emission source in of itself. There is an existing, at least on the pig side, a pig industry calculator that served them well, and they tend to be in New Zealand context very separate from our livestock and sheep and cattle farms. So that was the real reason that we didn't think it was necessary to include it, at least not at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. There have been a few questions now, but I think I would go in chronicle order. So I have another question here from John Katze. Would you consider including the ability to track changes, for example, year to year changes in emissions to the framework? So more rather thinking about future.
Yeah, so I could answer that. So that's part of one. The last of the principles or the criteria in the framework would be to review how the methods are planning to incorporate further updates. So for example, when the national inventory is updated, how is this incorporated then into the farm level method? And also as a part of the national inventory, the IPCC good practice guidance, it's important to document how the changes in methods changes the results on the farm level estimates. I could imagine that that could be a similar procedure also on the farm level. So to be able to track, now we made these changes to the method, so probably this will result that the uncertainty of the estimates becomes larger in some aspects, or that the estimates become a bit higher or a bit lower. So I think that's a very important point to be transparent about, and to have a clear documentation that updates and changes to the methods can also change the results, such that farmers don't, and also communicate that to farmers. So that's also another aspect on the farm level methods, and also an important question, how to communicate that to farmers then if there are changes and updates leading to my emissions on my farm becoming higher or lower. It's very important that that's also clearly documented and clearly communicated. So that's a topic that we also want to include in the framework, but that we didn't focus so much on in this presentation.
Maybe I'll just add, I think it's quite a good suggestion in a way to be able to, in terms of farms making changes year to year to reduce emissions, and whether the methods are comparable, not just in their levels, but in the way they reflect improvements in farm practice, because of course improvements in farm practice is what we want to see going forward. We're not doing this just to calculate. It's not just an accounting exercise.
Thank you. Then another question from Vicky Robinson. What are your views on how the data sources can reflect different sources of, for example, raw materials for feed or lower carbon fertilizer products?
Sorry, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. Maybe I need to digest that a bit. I don't know, Darren, if you have some immediate response.
Not off the top of my head. I think both of the two methods are scope 1 and just cover on farm emissions. So we neither of them get into the kind of upstream emissions from feed or fertilizer. I think that's another area. I mean, I guess in that question, I'd defer to some of the work that Koen de Konik's done at the OECD, looking at the 8 building blocks, and that was one of the 8 building blocks. But a different one to what we're talking about here tonight.
Thank you. Then another question from Andreas Jensen. Danish studies show different methane emissions. So this is going to for the question to the New Zealand team. Danish studies show different methane emissions per kilogram dry matter intake for fresh grass grazing versus silage feed. Do you see this in New Zealand as well? I don't know, that's a very detailed question maybe.
Ben, do you know the answer to that? I don't think we do see a difference, but Ben, you may know.
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers for silage feed. I mean, generally in the farm emissions method, all fresh pasture as well as all our supplementary feeds have associated metabolizable energy, dry matter digestibility, and nitrogen content values attributed to them, which will all vary. And essentially, those numbers, the first two, particularly for methane per kg of dry matter intake, determine the total amount. So I'd imagine there are some quite some small differences in the calculations there, but yeah, I don't know exactly the size of that without having the numbers to hand.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for these insights. Then another question from John Carter. If the goal is some level of consistency between countries, what is the impact of national inventories using different combinations of IPCC tires for different emission sources? And maybe, I don't know, you also have some preliminary recommendations there already, future work.
Yeah, so maybe I can start answering and you others can fill in if there is something to add. But I think it presents quite a complex question because as you said, the national inventories are naturally different in different countries, reflecting the large emission sources in that country's agricultural sector. And that will, of course, be reflected in the farm level tools. So we don't want to provide recommendations that everyone should use a high tier level for emissions that are not so important for farmers in those countries or those areas. And I think also there we can learn from how the IPCC, the recommendations that they provide for ensuring good practice in the national inventories, so to also ensure good practice on a farm level base, and also the UNFCCC review process. So it's a bit in the direction of a review process maybe that we are doing with our comparison, that we look into detail into the results of the two methods. So we don't say that this is something that should be done for every method, but we can say that this can gain insights into that despite the methods being different for good reasons and reflecting different emission sources, that we still can look at the sort of common denominators for the methods and see that at least there they are a good scientific base and that they produce reasonable estimates. So I think rather than saying all the methods need to be like this, we should say that the methods should provide these things, these aspects in terms for us to be able to verify if the methods are sound, so to say. And also what we found with the data, input data for the methods, that even though the equations are similar to calculate and take fermentation, the two countries also have, with good reasons, have different data inputs depending on what data their farmers have available, and so but that this still needs to be able to be comparable for one to be comparable between countries. So yeah, so maybe one recommendation there could be that the approaches should provide a sample data set to enable such a comparison, but that we cannot say that your data input should be in this or that way. Yeah, so I hope that answers the questions, and I don't know, Darren, if you want to add.
Thank you. Then maybe another question to the German team from Isabel Kahis. Does the German method consider or will consider carbon sequestration from on-farm vegetation?
So I think maybe I would hand over to Claudia on this one.
Yeah, hello everyone. Very interesting discussion. The method that was used here in this comparison didn't represent carbon sequestration, but we are to be able to compare it more closely also with the New Zealand approach, but we also have an API or a model used, of course, for the national inventory that can also be used on farm level application to also incorporate the emissions there. But in this presentation, this was now here only focused on methane and nitrate oxide emissions from dairy.
Okay, thank you.
But maybe Cora, if you want to add something there, you can also come in.
I think you covered it quite well. It's possible, but it's in the inventory. It's part of the LULUCF sector, and this was not part of this comparison. Though it is possible to consider it also for the farm calculations, but it wasn't compared here with the New Zealand method.
Okay, thank you. And I have another very detailed question to the New Zealand team from Quentin. If you have the milk yield, protein, fat, and lactose in the New Zealand tool from Dairy Lab directly or reported monthly by farmer, are you considering using milk spectrum data equation to estimate enteric fermentation?
I can respond and Ben can add. New Zealand farmers will get the milk yield, protein and fat data from their dairy processor. It's kind of a standard information they get, and that data feeds into the energetics equations that are used to estimate dry matter. So yeah, that's how that information's worked. So I'm not sure. I don't think it involves milk spectrum data.
Also, just reiterate that I'm not familiar with the milk spectrum data equation. Could be something to take offline, but as Darran said, we use that data and it goes in. Yes, it's a pretty regular input into most of the IPCC equations, but potentially could be something worth considering.
Okay. Then another question to the New Zealand team, rather at the broader policy level, I would say, from Leo Mercer. How challenging has it been continuing to develop policy on agricultural emissions reduction given the recent retrenchment from policies on agricultural emissions? Or are these technical work programs immune from the wider topic and changing? And I don't know if the German team may also answer to that.
Hi, Leo. Leo actually used to work on policy in New Zealand a few years ago, subsequently left to London. Good to hear from you. I mean, New Zealand, you know, it's normal to get new direction from as the government changes. So I guess that's just a usual part of policy process in all democratic countries. The work on the farm emissions method and more broadly the work on improving our greenhouse gas inventory and developing new mitigation technologies in particular has been seen as a priority, you know, across most of the recent governments. So it hasn't really changed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there was another more detailed question from Nick Hutchings. N2O is the other main agricultural GHG emission source. I guess both tools follow the excretion of nitrogen by livestock, manure management field. So can you account for the effect of changes in milk yield and feed ration on N2O emissions from manure management and soils?
So do you mean in the respective methods or in the comparisons? I think that would rather be a question to look when looking at the respective methods. So it's not really comparable between the methods, I would say. So of course, the milk, the intensity of farming and the milk yield per cow can influence other emissions than only enteric fermentation, but that's out of scope for our study, as we want to focus on the this emission source, enteric fermentation from dairy cows, which is overlapping between the two methods. So then, of course, also as experience when working with the method, that there is a lot of interdependencies between data inputs and between parameters in the method. So it feels a bit like everything is related to everything. It's a complex farming system. So of course, the milk yield per cow will affect enteric fermentation, but also feed into affecting N2O emissions. But that's not what we're looking at currently.
Yeah, it would have been nice to be able to compare nitrous oxide, because it's obviously an important greenhouse gas. I mean, I can add that the New Zealand method, Ben mentioned the feed inputs include the nitrogen content of the feed, so that does affect the nitrogen excretion onto pasture within the New Zealand method, and will change nitrous oxide emissions. And milk yield will higher yielding cows that must be eating more, so therefore generating more nitrous oxide as well. So it does feed through. But yeah, that was one element that we didn't feel we could really compare with between the two methods.
Okay, thank you. Then another question, going back to the discussion for scope 1 and for the scope 3 emissions from Luke Powell. So regarding scope 3 not being captured, does that mean that farms with imported feed, which do produce higher yield of milk but require much higher input, would be at an advantage through this accounting method? It sounds like the measurement models would incentivize using feed-based systems, which we know are more intensive.
I would say yes, but that you also need to use the methods being very aware of what you are accounting for. So it's clear, as we stated in the presentation, that both methods are considering scope 1, and then, yeah, it's important to be aware what emissions then are included and what emissions are not included. And I think this is rather part of a broader discussion, how to, when comparing different approaches, how to really clarify what are the different system boundaries and what are the different scopes included and the emission sources. And what we do here in our comparison is that we want to really zoom in on the part of the method there is similar, and there, of course, the feed that you give to the cattle has an impact of the enteric fermentation and the emission through this channel. But yeah, it also has impact on the whole farm emissions, but that's also out of scope what we do here. And I think it's important for a broader discussion to have that really clarified, and not use different methods in a way to sort of greenwash your emissions. So to have a clear transparency in what you are actually accounting for, and also maybe what you are not accounting for. And then not end up recommending strategies which just pushes the emissions to outside the scope 1 emissions. So so to have clear what you're estimating and what you're not including.
I think I'd just add to that, in the New Zealand context, the farm emissions method is used typically, particularly by Biological Sciences Institute, used alongside a separate method that does include the scope 3 emissions from feed and fertilizer and fuel, and that. So when they're used together, it does cover that. And so the disadvantage or the issue that you've raised does get covered off there. But it is something we're also thinking about more from the perspective of providing advice to farmers about where their emissions are coming from in that broader that broader framing.
Okay, thank you. Then another question regarding the different approaches from Claudia. Do you see large differences in milk or meat allocation methods between the approaches?
Yeah, so I will start answering and anyone can feel free to add to this, but I would say yes, and this is also something that we include in the comparison, but did not fit into the scope of this presentation. So we see that it is quite differently accounted for, not at least in different stock classes. So in the New Zealand farm emissions methods, the stock classes are clearly separated between dairy and beef production, while in the German AgriGHG-tool, they are differently accounted for, so not this as clearly separation between the two production systems. Also in the New Zealand method, there is the data input on the feed should also be allocated between dairy and beef production, where in the AgriGHG-tool, the feed is assumed on a regional level currently. So I would say that in the farm emissions method, it's accounted for more separately than in the AgriGHG-tool. Please correct me, Darren, if you disagree. So that was also a bit of a challenge when we looked at the overall methods and wanted to compare. So first we were looking at comparing enteric fermentation from cattle in general, which also came with big challenges then because there were so different allocation between dairy and beef, and also different differences in how the stock classes were defined. So that's also one other reason that we also really narrowed it down to enteric fermentation from dairy cows, because there it was possible to get the distinction, to really make sure that we look at the same things in the two methods. So yeah, that's an interesting question, which will be clearer in the written format of this study, but that didn't fit into this presentation. So I hope I could give a bit of an overview there.
It's an interesting example of kind of the little differences in data definitions between New Zealand and Germany. In New Zealand, as Elin said, we break down our livestock classes much more granularly. So, and I think that's something to think of learning from all of us involved in this, is just how important those little data differences are, and how easy, well, we went through several iterations, and several times we kind of got tripped up on differences that we didn't realize were there.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe on this one, like, like what kind of farms you considered for the comparison from Violetta Raschrik. Do you consider the comparison of farm level emissions in the same type of farms in New Zealand and Germany, for example, mixed farm, specialized in crops? I guess that doesn't count here because you focus on dairy farms, but yeah, I don't know, maybe you have already answered that, but maybe just another quick answer to this one.
Yeah, so for the comparison, we consider dairy farms, and we also don't compare the whole farm emissions, because they would naturally be very different due to the different emission sources accounted for in the two methods. So we look at dairy farms and specifically enteric fermentation from dairy cows.
I think we would have liked to have covered more farms than just dairy, but yeah, as we sort of went through the we do have cropping farms in New Zealand, but they're nowhere near as many as in Germany. So it's not a part of, on the New Zealand side, it's not a part of our method that is as developed as the German method is.
Yeah, thank you. Then maybe more practical question, and I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but from Thomas Chatsopoulos. Let's assume two countries that trade beef with each other agree on a bilateral border adjustment based on their emission intensities. How could these two countries reconcile their different methods when evaluating each other's emissions in a practical way?
I hope we've showed that today. That's kind of I think exactly one of the purposes or goals of this work is to develop a way of evaluating the two methods and testing whether they're comparable. As Elin said, both methods are quite well adapted to their respective countries, and it would be impractical to kind of use one method, in your example, across in those two countries. So I think it's more practical to test whether two country specific methods are comparable.
Yeah, I agree with what Darran said to answer this question. That yeah, hopefully our work can contribute in that direction to provide such a framework for being able to set up such a mechanism.
Yeah, and maybe then also at this stage advertise again our newsletter and our LinkedIn page, where you will stay tuned about any publications also in this regard from our high-level GHG accounting team. So this may also provide some guidance for future work in other countries. Yeah, I think we have 3 minutes left, so maybe one last question from Nick Hutchings. Estimating feed intake during grazing is notoriously difficult. How are farmers expected to get this input? Like here, I was pointing out energy budgeting. What is your view on this one?
Both methods, neither method requires farmers to estimate their feed intake. Both methods work by asking farmers for data about livestock numbers and in the case of dairy milk production, and then through energetic equations infer really the dry matter intake. So yeah, I think that question is a difficult one for the researchers that are working on trying to measure, trying to do the science really on methane emissions from cattle and measure, test mitigation actions and mitigation technologies. But in both of these methods, and I think from what I'm aware, all the methods I've seen around the world all work by inferring dry matter intake from variables like cattle numbers or live weights and milk production.
Okay, then with regard to time, I would like to thank our speakers and also the team behind that really great piece of work, and also for the insights today that you gave to us. And as we already mentioned, there will be more coming up. There will be also another webinar on the topic soon, which we will announce on the LinkedIn page and also through the newsletter. I just posted you the link in the chat, and I'm quite aware that we didn't cover all questions today, unfortunately. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us for any follow-ups. We are always happy to get in touch and discuss with you. And yeah, we will upload also the recording to the website and look forward to meet you online or in person at some point in the future. So have a good day here in Germany and a good rest at night in New Zealand and wherever you are in the world. And thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.